another problem to solve, but it's more general and it can be used for scenario. So how to give a quick intuition of how this timeout and these timing assumptions may appear inside these protocols. Here we have an example of a BFT protocol that operates basically by having a leader that proposes blocks for the other processes to deliver and agree upon. And the thing is that if the leader is faulty, since the leader can be faulty, we need to expect a certain flow of blocks every delta timeout, every time interval. Otherwise, in order to try to determine, okay, the leader is not proposing blocks for me to order new blocks, so maybe it's faulty, maybe it crashed, maybe something. So we have this delta parameter that we need to somehow account for. And the thing is that if the timeout expires, we simply try to elect a new leader. We say, okay, this one probably is faulty, we're not sure, but maybe it is. We'll elect a new one and increase the delta in the eventuality that eventually the delta is large enough, and we elect a correct leader. So this introduces an obvious problem that this delta is a free parameter that we have to tune when we deploy the system somewhere. For example, if we try to, it doesn't make sense to account for a delta value if we deploy some system inside here of the IST, or if we deploy it in a wide area network around the globe, it doesn't make any sense to use the same delta parameter. So we can have a protocol that we simply create and we deploy on that network, and it simply works independently of the network latencies and all that. So yeah, the idea what we could avoid is we could avoid this delta, and we could avoid like the problems that come with it, and in order to create some more robust protocols that we can simply create and deploy everywhere, which are asynchronous protocols that have no delta timeouts that we need to tune. So the question is, why don't we see more asynchronous problems? The thing is that there is a fundamental result in distributed systems which says that basically this is impossible. So we can all go home now because the presentation is over. But in reality, the thing is that it only excludes deterministic protocols, and there are randomized solutions that work fine as long as we are willing to accept the probabilistic guarantees that they give us. Particularly, there are efficient protocols that have been proposed over the years to solve simple problems such as agreeing on a single bit. Like instead of agreeing on more complex things, we agree on a single bit, and then we can compose them to create more interesting things in the context of blockchain, which is this for example, an atomic broadcast primitive that you can ignore all of that. And basically what it states is that you can use this in a sort of a way to agree on the order of the block, or on the order of blocks. So we can have everyone propose certain blocks, and we use this to agree on the final order of blocks. And this is obviously how we can use this in a blockchain system. There have been more and more proposals in recent years for protocols in this model, but the basic thing that they all have in common is that they follow sort of this all-to-all architecture, which is a little bit complex. I won't dive much into it, but they are relatively expensive, and they require a lot of messages to be exchanged. Here we see there in the message complexity, we see that it's cubic, and which is very relatively bad. To be honest, and what we thought that we could do in the scope of my thesis was to try to decrease this to a quadratic complexity. So this brings us to the idea of Alia BFT, which is the protocol that I'll be presenting here today, which is an atomic broadcast protocol based on randomization, which is able to tolerate Byzantine faults, which means that processes can deviate arbitrarily from the protocol spec as long as they obey within a certain threshold. It's completely asynchronous, and maybe it has a quadratic message complexity. I'll put a question mark there because we'll see if it makes a little bit more sense later on. But the idea here is that we sort of decompose this all-to-all architecture that they have here we attempt to do it so in more of a leader-based type of thing. So we have a single replica that proposes a transaction, it sends it to everyone, and then the others execute a single binary, follow with a single binary agreement in an attempt to determine, okay, is this broadcast terminate or not, and should I deliver what was proposed or not? Okay, so here we have process P0, it proposes the value, and since the binary agreement the following binary agreement, which is that ABA there, so for the abbreviation, we deliver that transaction. we then proceed to the next process. We sort of rotate the leaders constantly. And in this case, the binary agreement is set for 0, so we cannot deliver the proposal. There is an obvious problem with this initial approach, which is how do we determine if we should propose a 0 or a 1 to this binary agreement, because the protocol is asynchronous and I'm waiting for a broadcast that should or not, that may or may not terminate. When do I decide, okay, I'm going to abort on this and propose a 0, or I'm going to say, okay, I'm willing to wait a little bit more and eventually I receive it and propose a 1. So, and this is obviously we cannot solve this without using some sort of timeout. An obvious solution would be, okay, I wait for this timeout and then I propose, but I can't do that because then I have a timeout to tune. So our solution is that when we propose a value, and it's the same thing, we propose a value, broadcast it to all of them. In this, some of them received it, the others don't. So the ones that received it propose 1 into the Java or a 0. And the thing is that if the Java decided for 0 and for it not to be delivered, instead of discarding it and redoing everything on another iteration, when we elect P0 again to be the leader, what we do is we simply persist it in a sort of preordered queue, and then we do 6, and then when we elect P0 again to be the leader, the binary agreement won't decide about its new proposal, but for the older one, which in the meantime was cached there because it wasn't delivered. So we sort of have some growing queues that of pending ordered proposals that rest there between the broadcast and the agreement that follows. Yes, which basically by doing this we can solve the proposal problem of not knowing what to propose to the Java, and we can go cyclically and decide immediately. So one thing that I'm left out, and which is solves basically that question mark that I had there about the complexity, is that here we have to execute not a single Java instance per proposal, but we may have to execute multiple. So in this example, we had to execute two for that red colored block. The first time it was cached, but it decided for 0, and the second time it decided for 1, because in the meantime more processes received the proposal and they voted, and the Java ended up deciding for 1. And we call this in the context of our protocol our sigma value, which on our experimental evaluations we concluded that it basically tends to 1 for almost every single system scale without a particular malicious network scheduler. So we can basically say that maybe it's quadratic if the sigma follows like that. So every process proposes, so we have like the multiple queues, and then the Java follows. Another thing that I left out is what is this broadcast primitive that we use. Basically, we use a verifiable consistent broadcast. I won't dive much into it either, but the idea is that it's less expensive than the broadcast protocol that the other solutions use. But it has a problem such that it's possible for a process not to deliver something. So I sent to some of them, and there is one of them that does not deliver it, which is in this case what happens to P1. P1 never delivers the red block, but after the Java, if the Java decides for 1, it has to somehow find out what value that should have been in order to actually deliver and propose it as a block. So this broadcast primitive gives us an ability to sort of actively request it from other replicas, because it creates a cryptographic proof associated with that value, which you can then actively fetch. So we have this sort of initial fast path, which is relatively cheap, and then eventually we may have to execute a more expensive protocol afterwards. So I'm not sure if I have much more time for the experimental evaluation. So basically we run typical latency, throughput, transactions per second, and all of those good things. And here is we measure the sigma, and we show that red line, it basically falls into 1 by measuring the number of messages that are generated by the protocol. And I'll just skip into this one slide, which is the differences in throughput that we achieve for different system scales when comparing Alio with the other protocols that are basically what's considered sort of the state of the art for asynchronous atomic broadcast protocols. And as we can see, we achieve much higher throughput values for every system scale, and we actually scale better because we have our decrease as this in throughput as the system scale increases is actually much smaller. So here the conclusion that we take is that we are able to present in this work some radical improvements over state-of-the-art asynchronous atomic broadcast protocols that can be used to order blocks within a distributed ledger or a blockchain. This is relatively better than what we have, but it's still slower than those protocols that rely on certain timing assumptions, despite being more flexible and being able to deploy it everywhere. So we could maybe integrate this into an hybrid approach of a protocol that eventually falls back into this when the guarantees are not met. And finally, we can simply use it by itself in a sort of a distributed ledger in order to order blocks.
Thank you, Afonso.